Thank you for the opportunity to present to this standing committee. I wish to acknowledge the land and the people of Treaty 1 and Treaty 5 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. My name is Hilda Anderson-Pyrz, and I'm the co-chair of the MMIWG Manitoba Coalition. The MMIWG Manitoba Coalition is comprised of diverse Indigenous representation from nonprofit women and family serving organizations, Indigenous governments, individuals, MMIWGS, 2S+, and family members and survivors. I am here because you really need to understand us as Indigenous people and how COVID-19 is impacting Indigenous communities and organizations. Canada, you need to respect the sovereignty of nations and allow for the autonomy to make our own decisions. We need you settlers to listen, not because it is a nice thing to do, but because it is the lawful thing to do. What the pandemic is doing is exasperating the inequalities that we already knew were there. We are seeing violence, we are seeing discrimination, and now we are seeing more violence. And we are faced with challenges about how we provide frontline supports for people because of the physical distancing and the lack of adequate resources. The pandemic is exaggerating our crisis. We knew the healthcare systems in First Nation communities were poor before, and now we are seeing truly what a breaking point they are at when it comes to supporting survivors of violence and those impacted by the pandemic. We are living the impact of short-term project-specific funding, which is detrimental to Indigenous communities and organizations. Stable long-term funding is critical to having the capacity and the ability to pivot quickly into something like a pandemic. The communities know best where they need to pivot to meet the needs of that moment. What the pandemic is showing us is that we need to be nimble. You cannot simply ask Indigenous communities and organizations to pivot all their funding to the COVID-19 pandemic because the disparity Indigenous communities and organizations were dealing with before the pandemic is still there. And in some areas, there is even a greater need. Yes, we need COVID funding, and Indigenous people still need the funding that was inadequate before the pandemic. Yes, we need the anti-violence funding. We now need that more than ever, and we need specific resources to respond to the COVID context. Additionally, we have seen that there has been an increase in the number of gender and human rights violations, such as the lack of access to food security, shelter, and medical care. We do not have the adequate resources to address and support victims of violence. If supports are not readily available, we will continue to die and experience alarming rates of violence. It is time for this government to fully implement the 231 calls for justice. We cannot wait any longer. Our lives are sacred. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. My name is Sandra DeLaronde, and I'm also co-chair of the Manitoba Coalition. And we thank the Standing Committee for the opportunity to present today. We acknowledge this government and provincial territorial governments for finally establishing a national inquiry in 2016 after more than 20 years of advocacy by families, survivors, and Indigenous women's organization, though we are concerned about the lack of inclusion in creating a national strategy to end the violence. This pandemic is highlighting the desperate and impossible situation our women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA find themselves in. Imagine the terror of being locked in with your abuser for weeks and now months. We have 3 requests for this committee. The first one is Winnipeg is the only city without a low barrier safe space for women and girls to protect them from staggering rates of violence and by intimate partners and through trafficking. And 2, that along with the violence walks homelessness, particularly for Indigenous women who are fleeing. The lack of decent housing in the city and on reserve means that multiple generations of families live in a single family home. In some communities, the count ranges to up to 30 people in a 2-bedroom home. This chronic underfunding and profoundly inadequate circumstance existed long before COVID-19. But the pandemic is more deadly because women have no housing options and nowhere to go. Of the 634 First Nations in Canada, only 46 funded women's shelters. Only 4 shelters exist in Manitoba First Nations. The final quick point I'd like to make is on mental health and well-being. The long-term effects need to be addressed now and for the long term. As a coalition, we'd like to thank Leah Gazan, MP for Winnipeg Centre, for her efforts in supporting our community to ensure the well-being of Indigenous women and indeed all women who are at risk for violence. We look forward to working with this government to end violence and make this country one where every human being is safe, because we deserve nothing less. And we remember those many women, mothers, daughters, sisters that have gone missing or murdered because of a lack of action.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And my questions will be directed at the coalition. I just want to first start out by commending you for your presentation. It was powerful. And, I think, certainly important for this committee. My first question is actually for you, Sandra. You spoke about the need for a 24/7 low barrier safe space in your presentation. Can you expand on the need and tell us a little bit more about what that would look like?
Thank you, Ms. Gazan. First, I'd like to say that there has been a pandemic of violence against Indigenous women and girls for as long as this country has been in Confederation. And that pandemic did not receive any license from government until the National Inquiry. And the failure to act on the calls to justice for the National Inquiry have provided license to individuals across this country, whether it be in domestic partnerships or in trafficking situations, to continue to devalue the lives of Indigenous women and girls. And that needs to be said. Secondly, on your question about the 24/7 low barrier safe space, what a safe space looks like is that it's not constrained by the barriers of shelters, which are generally for people in domestic relationships. A low barrier safe space would be available for people that are not in domestic situations, who are LGBTQII individuals, or people that are homeless, or people that are trafficked. Those individuals today cannot access a shelter. Also, we know that violence is not limited to Indigenous women and girls, that it's across the country, across ethnicity, and that we want to ensure the safe space in Winnipeg be inclusive of all women and women identifying individuals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Just another question. I know you're very familiar with the calls to justice in the National Inquiry, and I just want to speak specifically to Call to Justice 1.2V. As you know, the National Inquiries are framed around human and Indigenous rights and international conventions. How has the government fared in honoring their international obligations, such as their obligations to uphold human rights and Indigenous rights, in relation to respecting the dignity of Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people?
Well, I have to say that historically, since Confederation, Canada has failed to acknowledge and adhere to basic principles of human rights when it comes to Indigenous women and girls. So, hence the finding of genocide in the National Inquiry. And I think what's important to note is that any adherence by Canada to conventions, international human rights conventions, has been because Indigenous women have fought for their rights, and they have been recognized for the inclusion of those rights through the implementation of Bill C-31 and Bill S-3. And I think what's really important and critical right now, this government has committed to the implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and have said, oh, well, we can't do it now because there's a pandemic. This is the time to be doing it. And I really call on the government and all parties to ensure that this implemented into law in Canada now.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Just moving on to you, Hilda. So, as you know, we're coming up to the 1-year anniversary of the National Inquiry, and the government, let's hope they keep their promise, has indicated that the National Action Plan would be released in June. Do you feel that families and organizations have been adequately consulted during this process? You're on mute, Hilda. Oh, you're on mute. Thank you.
Sorry, absolutely not. As someone who's on the front lines in my role as the manager of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Liaison Unit for the Manitoba Kiwatnik-Okimakanek, and as someone who sits as the co-chair for the Manitoba MMIWG Coalition, and hearing from families and survivors and two-spirited people in Manitoba, everybody is wondering what is happening, and there has been little to no consultation, considering, that Minister Bennett has often referred to Manitoba as ground zero with respect to the national tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So it's very disheartening. The stories that families and survivors shared with the national inquiry, which was put into motion by many, many women fighting for years and years, to not be consulted and to not know what's happening really devalues women and girls and survivors and two-spirited people who shared their testimony. We need to ensure that those voices remain on the forefront, because those are the stories of their loved ones. Those stories are sacred and they should be consulted through the entire process, including in the development of a national action plan. Yes. Shame on the Liberal government.
Chair, my last question is for the coalition again, specifically Hilda. You mentioned that there are only 46 women's shelters in the country and only 4 in Manitoba. And clearly this is a crisis. I know I live in Manitoba. Where are the gaps and what needs to happen immediately to protect Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people?
The gaps exist in infrastructure to provide these safe spaces, as well as capacity development, especially when we look at our First Nation communities. Even in urban environments, many of the same challenges we experience in our communities exist in urban environments too, because Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited and gender diverse people are often forgotten in program development or accessing those resources. And ending poverty, I always say this because we need to end poverty. Many of our women and girls end up in these vulnerable situations because of poverty. And I want to reiterate, that the federal government needs to immediately implement the Call for Justice 4.5, the Guaranteed Annual Livable Income. Because if you can find safe spaces to live, and if you're able to thrive and you're able to grow and you're able to access different resources that are readily available or currently being developed, that is so critical. If we can't have that, and if we can't develop from an Indigenous lens, and that we're at the table, that we're making those decisions, we're developing those plans, you're going to continue to see extreme levels of violence, because we cannot, accept paternalistic approaches anymore. We have our own ways and they need to be respected to protect our women and girls and two-spirited people.